If you'd have asked me 15 years ago, would freedom of speech be a live issue in contemporary Britain, I would have laughed at you. But now here we are in a situation where, people really don't feel that they can speak freely about multiple issues. So I think the question is, are the societies we call liberal democracies liberal anymore? And is there anything that we can do about it?
Welcome to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm Adam Dixon. Today, I'm joined by Mark Pennington, who is Professor of Political Economy and Public Policy at King's College London. He has a new book out on Foucault and liberal political economy, a book that some might say, Foucault and liberal political economy? Well, Mark wrote the book, and that's what we're going to talk about today, the subtitle of which is Power, Knowledge, and Freedom. Mark, welcome to the New Enlightenment.
Thank you very much. Very good to be here.
Right. First question. Listeners are wondering, who is Michel Foucault? I mean, some people, I'm sure, if you've been to university, you've heard of Foucault, if you study social sciences, because he, if I'm correct, is one of the highest cited, I mean, he's dead, highest cited scholars of all time. Who is Foucault?
I think he's actually the most highly cited person. If you use these common metrics like Google Scholar, I think he's way out in front of anybody. And that reputation was developing during the 1970s and early 1980s, but it's taken off even more actually since he died in 1984. Probably just slackening off a little bit at the moment, but he's still by far and away, I think, the most influential social theorist of the last 50 years, I would say.
So who was he? What's give us the potted, the short bio of Foucault and his work, and why he has and still is so influential?
I think one of the reasons he's very influential is because his work isn't actually easy to pigeonhole in any one specific discipline. So there are people who would say that he's a historian of thought. There are people who would say he's a social theorist. There are people who would say he is a philosopher. And you can make a case for all of those. And because his work cuts across all of these different fields, especially in sort of broadly speaking, the social sciences that overlap with arts and humanities, he's had huge reach across all of these different fields because of the specific sorts of theoretical concepts he developed. And I think the best way to summarize his work is that he's concerned very much with the way in which how we understand ourselves as people and as communities is conditioned by systems of thought and the way that those systems of thought interact with what he would call relations of power. So the way in which individuals try to influence one another, try to exert some form of social control or pressure over other individuals. So it's very much about the interaction of systems of social influence, if you like, with systems of thought and how those are sort of intertwined in various ways.
Could you give us an example, just so people can understand when you say systems of thought? What does that mean practically for the person on the street that's wondering, who is this Michel Foucault, this French philosopher?
So something like claims to scientific expertise would be an important example of this. So if we have a system of thought or a set of concepts that circulate in a society that say, for example, that we should always follow the science when there is a public health problem such as a pandemic, then that discourse, as Foucault would understand it, has what he would call power effects. So when you say follow the science, well, who are the scientists? How do they actually establish the authority to call themselves a scientist? Why do people follow the kind of expertise that they claim to have? These are the kind of questions that Foucault's perspective would be asking. And he thinks very much that there are sort of almost like implicit rules that underlie these discourses or narratives, as he would understand them, that position certain people in certain ways and that influence the extent to which they can exercise power over other people.
And so then your new book is on this Michel Foucault and his influence, or at least his connection with liberal political economy. Before we go into that, perhaps it's worthwhile, and I don't want to assume that listeners don't know what liberal political economy is, or liberalism for that matter. I mean, I hope that the listeners that are attracted to a podcast at Adam Smith's house already have a good understanding of liberalism and the liberal tradition. But for those that don't, and so we can have a better understanding of his connection, or the connection of Foucault with liberalism. What is the liberal tradition generally, and then what is it in terms of political economy?
Well, I think there are two aspects of it. So there's one aspect which is a kind of liberal attempt to understand how the world actually works. Mm-hmm. And that aspect of liberal political economy is an approach to understanding the relationships between politics and economics that emphasizes the scope for individual agency at some level to influence social outcomes. So a lot of people in the liberal tradition, although this is quite a confusing term, would subscribe to what's called methodological individualism. So at a certain level, you cannot understand social outcomes without going back down to sort of micro level to understand individual acts of agency and how they kind of sum up to some kind of overall social outcome. So that's one aspect of that, although that's quite a complicated story, as we might get into a little bit later in the conversation. So that is a kind of analytical focus on individual agency in explaining social outcomes. But there's also then a kind of normative liberal project. And that would be a project that is looking for institutional arrangements that protect the scope for that individual agency against both public forms of power associated with the state and also in different contexts with private forms of power. So there's very much a normative concern with the maintenance of individual freedom. Individual freedom is seen to be a kind of ethical value, and you're concerned with the kind of institutional arrangements that protect that freedom.
Now, just on that methodological individualism, though, isn't that a fairly narrow view of liberalism, in the sense that if it puts everything on individual decision-making or individual agency, it still ignores, let's say, the structures of the rule of law and government, which, although there's individuals' decisions happening within those frameworks and those social institutions have created or have been created by individuals, or they've, come about in various ways, but they still provide some level of, let's say, structure, such that the structures influence individual decision-making, and therefore methodological individualism, though providing some, let's say, analytical purchase to explaining particular outcomes, don't give you the full story. And
I think that's right. And I think this is why it's important to recognize that there are different streams within the liberal tradition. So there is one stream which I would associate very much with what is called rational choice theory, which is very much, I think, guilty of the kind of mistake, if you like, that you just alluded to. So it explains everything in individualistic terms. So even institutions are explained in rationalistic terms, that institutions arose from some kind of rational choice of individual agents. They may have chosen to act collectively to produce an institution, but the emphasis is very much on the idea that the institution was chosen. But that is not all of liberal political economy. Right. There is a whole other tradition within liberal political economy that actually emphasizes the role of social traditions, cultural norms, or value systems as unchosen constraints that condition the individual's opportunity set, that actually condition the range of choice that agents may have. And that is the stream of liberalism that I think is very much compatible with a thinker like Foucault, who is concerned with the way in which systems of social thought, or discourses or narratives can actually condition people's scope to exercise their agency or their freedom. And that's one of the reasons I think there's scope for a kind of productive dialogue between people who are in the Foucault tradition and people who are in this, what I would call a postmodern or non-rationalist stream within the liberal tradition that can't be accused of this kind of atomized view of the individual that the rational choice theorists have.
Okay, so that brings me to my question about, and you've kind of answered it, is what attracted you to Michel Foucault and wanting to write this particular book, and we'll get into this as well as, what's the need for it from an academic perspective, but I think more importantly, what is is the need for it, or what we can do with it in a more practical sense? Is it, and hopefully we can get to this. I mean, I wanted to say an anecdote, which I think is a bit comical. I mean, you were at Penmere House recently, and Sam Gregg was there, and Sam knew, and I've had Sam on the podcast before, and you know, it was funny to see Sam discuss you writing this book as almost as if, you know, you're doing something crazy by writing this book about how, you know, you're a liberal and you're writing a book about Michel Foucault. And of course we can't write about Michel Foucault, which I thought, I mean, Sam wasn't being mean or anything, but it's interesting in the sense that it shows that academic communities or intellectual communities can be very, very kind of, you know, you're not allowed to engage with Karl Marx because, you know, communism, or you're not allowed to engage with, you know, Foucault because of, you know, something else, right? The governmentality, you can't do that because it's not pure enough. So, but how then did you kind of break down these sort of tribal affiliations, and why?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. So there's one reason, as somebody, I mean, I do call myself very much a liberal and a classical liberal. And I find it remarkable that so few people, in fact, there's hardly anybody in the modern contemporary sort of classical liberal tradition who has seriously attempted to look at Foucault's ideas.
Right.
I just couldn't find anybody who'd done it in any systematic way. You can find the odd little piece here and there on small aspects of his thought, but there's virtually nothing. And I find that remarkable, A, because he is, as I said before, the most influential thinker, I think. You can at least make a case for that in the last 50 years. And B, many of the concerns he has are concerns that are shared by classical liberals. So he's concerned about how systems of social control that operate through these discourses and various technologies of government, as he would call them, actually constrain the space for individual agency. And as I said before, that is a central concern of the liberal tradition. So it seems to me very odd that people who profess to be concerned with individual freedom wouldn't then look at a writer who understands in a very particular way a certain set of threats to that freedom that I think people in the classical liberal tradition have underplayed or failed to engage with sufficiently. So that's one of the reasons I really wanted to write this book. And the other reason is, although it's very much a kind of subtext to the book, is that Foucault himself seemed to go through a sort of transition in his own thinking, that by the end of I think in the early 1970s, he was very much associated with a kind of radical left, almost revolutionary politics kind of position. But it was clear that by the mid to late 70s, that had moderated quite significantly. And by the early 1980s, he was making arguments that sounded very much compatible with a certain kind of liberalism. So there's this very famous set of lectures that he gave in 1978-79 that were published as The Birth of Biopolitics, which actually give what many people consider to be a very sympathetic account of various thinkers in the liberal tradition. So he looks at people in the Austrian School of Economics, he looks at people in the ordo-liberal tradition, and he also looks at some Chicago School thinkers like Gary Becker. And what is remarkable about these lectures is that there's actually no real sustained critique of these ideas contained in these lectures. They seem to indicate at various points almost an endorsement of the ideas. And this has led to a whole proliferation of literature in the last sort of few years about whether or not Foucault at the end of his life had converted to some form of liberalism or even neoliberalism, as people often refer to it. Now, in my book, I don't engage that question about whether Foucault himself had this kind of transition. But I think the very fact that he was interested in questions about what systems of power can do to individuals is a reason why liberals should be interested in him. And I believe that if you look in depth at some of the kind of concepts that inform all of his work, they have parallels within the liberal tradition. And those are the things that I try to draw out in the books. What I'm trying to do in the book is to show how at a fundamental philosophical level, there are commonalities between Foucault's ideas about the nature of individual agency and how it relates to social structure. That are also present in the liberal tradition. And these can be brought together in productive ways to understand how freedom today could be threatened.
Okay, before we come back to freedom today, I'm just interested in the context and this evolution of Foucault. And so, I mean, he's a part of the 1968, kind of intellectual movement in France, radical leftism. Do you think it was like many intellectuals in that period came disillusioned with what, let's say, Soviet communism came, right, as this overly authoritarian, wasn't this liberating force that was creating a different economic system? And was that part of his shift then from, this hope of kind of moving away from capitalism and I mean, he was more of a Maoist, was he, I believe, than more of a Soviet communist or Marxist.
There was a brief period in the 1970s where he was involved with various kind of Maoist groups. It was never actually that clear whether he was a Maoist himself or whether it was this kind of strategic alliance he formed with these groups. Likewise, he was very briefly a member of the French Communist Party, as a lot of intellectuals were, but that didn't last for very long. I think he was certainly influenced by the Soviet experience or the East European experience. So he ends up some lectures actually there's a series of lectures before the birth of biopolitics called Security, Territory and Population. And he describes the Eastern Bloc societies, all of them, as societies of generalized obedience. And for someone who's all about breaking free from the chains of obedience or authority, this is clearly a condemnatory statement. So he saw them as systems of totalizing control. And he was involved quite actively with the Solidarity movement in Poland, which was, you could say had a sort of liberal edge to it. He was interested in looking at possibly more decentralized forms of potentially of socialism. So arguments around worker cooperatives within a competitive system, these kind of ideas. But I think he was also quite disillusioned by what he saw as being some of the dependency effects generated within liberal societies by some of the apparatuses of the welfare state. So it wasn't just concerns about what was happening in, full-blown socialist countries. He was also looking at systems of power within liberal democracies that are associated with welfare regimes or kind of paternalistic policies that he also thought had a kind of enervating effect on the scope for people to exercise their agency. And this starts to come through very much in the writings of the late 70s and early 1980s.
It's funny because you say that and you could respond, oh, so he's a libertarian. I mean, in a way, if he's so concerned about, the control over individuals and individual freedom, I mean, he sounds like a libertarian. Before we moved on to the contemporary stuff, though, I want you to define postmodern liberal political economy, because some people will think of postmodernism as just waffle. I don't know if that'll come out well in the podcast, waffle, but they'll think of postmodernism as just making everything up. It's you can deconstruct everything. It's all narrative. It's all, that's what people think of postmodernism, and particularly in this political environment where there's no appetite, at least in certain parts of the political spectrum, for any sort of postmodern thought, because they think the postmoderns are the ones that have come in and destroyed the university. They've created all these problems, and truth doesn't matter because it's all socially constructed. Define how you sit and what is postmodern liberal political economy in that respect.
Well, I think there's a lot of nonsense spoken about what postmodernism is. It is certainly based on, I would say, a skepticism of universal truth claims. And that's where the idea of the sort of relativism comes in. But it is not claiming that there are no facts about the world or that there's no truth at all. It's urging that people, you could say almost in a properly scientific sense, have a skepticism about what we consider to be truth. And that we recognize that many of the things that we consider to be true and unchanging are actually a product of various historical contingencies, which are also embedded in these attempts by various actors in society to exercise power over us, by people's attempts to exercise power over each other. So it's not saying there is no truth. It's saying that whatever we consider to be true, we might have reason to follow it. We might have reason to follow certain forms of expertise, but we've always got reason to be skeptical of it, because we know that if we look historically, notions of what is true change quite radically. And we also know that often when people make truth claims, they do it to try to exercise power over us, to try to get us to do things that they want us to do to serve their interests. And that doesn't mean that all of science is just about a naked power grab, but it means that we need to be aware of the fact that it's not this purely neutral realm. So that's the way I see postmodernism.
And it's interesting you say that and use the word postmodernism, but if you go back to the Scottish Enlightenment, I mean, skepticism was at the heart of Smith and David Hume and his contemporaries. I mean, they were living in a society where religion was still quite powerful, and they were skeptical, and that was just part of it. And so I think, we tend to think of what is post, right? When actually we should have always been modern. And that's where, for me, I've said to people, there's nothing wrong with Jacques Derrida and deconstruction. Actually, it might serve a nice purpose at times, right? They're sort of looking at how we use language and deconstructing narratives, and it has an analytical purpose. The problem is often those that are the postmoderns then take that and they create their own truths about the world, right? So on the one hand, they start from this, we need to be skeptical of these socially constructed norms about gender or race or all these things. And then they create a truth claim on it so on the one hand, they start from this perspective of we need to, what it means to be a woman or a man, and that there's different gender roles. And sometimes these are socially constructed. And you think, okay, that we can get on board with that because there's certain, gender roles that women have been given, and those are socially and historically contingent, and maybe we can deconstruct them. But then they take it to a next level and say, like, well, gender's whatever you make of it. And you think they this radical social constructionism that creates new truths. And then those that are then skeptical of them are treated as, reactionaries and the like. And then we have the politics that we have to this day.
This is actually one of the reasons why I think postmodernism has got properly understood affinities with the liberal tradition as I would understand it. So, the test of any theory, I think, whether you call it postmodern or anything else, is whether it is willing to subject its own claims to challenge and contestation. And what liberalism is about, at least the kind of liberalism I would want to defend, is basically saying, yes, many things in life are socially constructed. They are the product of various power relations or attempts to engage influence over others. And that's exactly why we need to subject all social constructions, including social constructionism itself, to competition. So a liberal environment is about having an environment where different social constructs actually come into contestation with each other. And it's only through that contestation that you've really got any hope of sort of learning or evolution in the world. Whereas if someone claims to have discovered the absolute truth and then is willing to police it in the way that you suggest that maybe some of the postmodernists do themselves, that's kind of the end of social learning. It's the end of discovery. It's the end of exploration, which, in my view, a free society and a liberal society is all about.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting you say that, because I do look at, there's an interesting mix it seems close relationship between classical liberals, and particularly in the United States, and often the conservative or the conservative right, in a way that I find really fascinating, right? Where they claim to be classical liberals, but then have particular norms that they want to impose on others, or they have conservative values. And I'm just saying, me personally, I don't have a problem with people having conservative values. I believe in plural societies, and there's a role for different sides to force us to think about the world in a different way. And if those are conservative ideas, then that's fine. But that there should be space for those that challenge them. But I always find it interesting how there's a close affinity, it seems, when you look at think tanks or those that support classical liberalism. There's always sometimes that undercurrent of religiosity, I would say, which I find really kind of fascinating, because a conservative and a liberal, they should almost be like oil and water. I mean, Friedrich Hayek wrote Why I'm Not a Conservative, and it's for some of these various reasons. And I I mean, perhaps I'm taking us off on a different tangent, but it's something I think about. How do we navigate that, or how do liberals navigate this? Because on the one hand, maybe it's okay, right, that there's people on the right and the left that are still classical liberals, and that's okay.
Well, this is actually a really interesting question. So there's two ways I'd answer it. One is, I think if you understand the libertarian or classical liberal movement in the United States, the way it developed really from the 1960s through to about 10 years ago, I would say, you can't separate that from Cold War politics. So there's what was called, I mean, it's actually known in the libertarian movement there as fusionism, where you had a kind of fusion between people who were basically libertarians or classical liberals and people who were conservatives, because they saw the big enemy as Soviet communism. And therefore they had a sort of tactical alliance, which was, we can tolerate some of the differences we have between us around, for example, free love or homosexuality or women's liberation or whatever, which the libertarians were always in favor of, or many of them were, and the more conservative forces, which were very skeptical of those things, to put it mildly, because the main enemy was the Soviet bloc. And that informed a great deal of what happened in many of the think tanks you're referring to, right the way through until about 10, 15 years ago. I think it's very interesting to see what is happening now in that movement, where actually that fusionism has now really been wrought asunder by Donald Trump. Right. So you now do have very clearly some groups who've gone over to a fully conservative position, and then you have the libertarians. So I think that's the kind of historical context. Now, the other question, or the other sort of part of what the question you're asking, I think really is a more philosophical question about the nature of conservatism. And certain forms of conservative thought, actually, I think, are actually very compatible with what I would call a postmodern perspective. So if you look at thinkers like Michael Oakeshott, for example, they're very much of the idea that everything is down to historical contingencies, traditions that don't necessarily have some rational underpinning, but which we might nonetheless have got reason to value, even though we don't think they represent some underlying truth. So conservatives who value certain forms of beauty, for example, in architecture, these sorts of things, they're not claiming that that represents some underlying eternal truth, but they're saying that a particular society may have discovered certain things that it has reason to value contingently that might be worth preserving. And that kind of conservatism is actually very compatible with, I think, what I call a postmodern view. So you have two kinds of postmodernism, actually. You have one kind which I think is, maybe we can talk about this more later, the Foucault kind, and the kind of entrepreneurial kind that I would support, which is all about change, disruption, challenging social constructs, and allowing new ones to emerge. And if you like, a kind of conservative resistance movement to that, which is about preserving certain historical ways of doing things, not wanting to innovate too much. And I think there's interesting debates to be had in this kind of creative tension between those two sorts of traditions.
Because in many ways, I mean, you mentioned Oakeshott, but the Scots and Adam Smith were fairly conservative. I mean, Smith was not, or the Anglo-Irish statesman Edmund Burke, they were not revolutionaries, and they were really concerned about the French Revolution and what that meant. And, and it was all down to that conservatism and I think it was in part because they were worried that, okay, if you break everything down, the outcome might be worse. And therefore, we should be cautious with change, and that there are certain values in particular social structures, whether it be the monarchy or particular social classes, that you don't want to disrupt too much because the outcome could be worse for everyone. And so I think that's where you can still be a liberal like Adam Smith, but still be conservative in that wanting to preserve tradition, history, particular forms of, what we deem to be beautiful architecture, art. And I would like that as well, right? Because you do look at something that's beautiful and like, that was done right? If you listen to, Chopin and you think, wow, and I'm just saying this because I'm I'm learning one of his nocturnes this summer instead of reading books. And I just think every time I play it, I'm like, wow, this is just like the pinnacle of beauty, right? And you think, but you had to have people like Chopin or Beethoven that were still entrepreneurs and driving music forward. But now we look back and like, oh, we should conserve this beauty. And so I think, yeah, but like you said, it's that, and but at the same time, I'm very much into experimentation and let's challenge things. Why not? See what happens. But it's that tension between, I think, that's really, really kind of fascinating, which we need more of, right? It's not an either or.
This is very much one of the things that is a theme in the book, where this kind of tension between radical change, or what I call in the book, if you like, cultural creative destruction, and the kind of economic forms of that, are in tension with the desire of certain people to preserve certain things or not to have too much change. And you see this actually in Foucault's own writings. So in the period in the early 1970s or mid 1970s, his approach seems to imply that because we're always embedded in these social routines or social constructs, to be free actors, we need to have something like permanent revolution. Well, we're constantly inventing new routines, challenging everything. That, to put it mildly, would be an exhausting form of life. From one day to the next, we had to reinvent ourselves literally almost every day. But by the late 1970s, his own position is emphasizing a kind of wariness of total revolution, and much more is about incremental change, like facilitating, greater freedoms for gays and lesbians, or women, which don't involve total revolutions in the whole of society. So even in a thinker like Foucault, you see that tension between the creative destruction aspect and not wanting to destroy everything through a kind of excessively revolutionary form of politics. And I think that's an interesting parallel, again, between somebody like Foucault and some of the Scottish Enlightenment skeptics. That he moves towards a position which is very much in line with what philosophers call immanent criticism.
Right.
Criticizing within a tradition, you're not trying to just overthrow the whole thing and have a kind of liberatory experience. So he thinks that liberation, the idea that you can free yourself from power completely, is an illusion, and is actually a very dangerous notion.
So let's move a bit further into the book, and you use Foucault's concept of dispositifs, or apparatuses, to use the English, to problematize four contemporary policy areas: social justice, public health, ecological sustainability, and law and order. Could you explain how these pastoral dispositifs, these apparatuses, operate today, and in what ways they might inadvertently constrain freedom rather than enhance it? And I perhaps not go through all four areas, but maybe pick one or two that you think are, partly because you want people to go off and buy the book. But pick a couple perhaps, and go in a bit more detail and put some flavor to what that means.
So the idea of a dispositive is the notion that you can have a kind of coalition or alignment between certain sorts of understandings or narratives about the world and the set of techniques that go along with it. And these become aligned with the powers of the state. So part of this power operates through the discourses, the concepts, or the ideas, and part of it operates the way these are intertwined with state power. Now, I argue in the book that there's a common set of these dispositives which share certain kinds of assumptions. The first assumption is the idea that society is a kind of manageable or knowable object. It's potentially legible to a set of experts. Now, different thinkers or traditions will disagree about who the experts are or who they should be, but they share the view that society is knowable and it's potentially manageable, and that it can be managed to produce what the experts in question consider to be desirable outcomes, usually which are couched in terms of the welfare of the population. So you look at society and through this sort of expert lens, and you identify various disequilibria. So those disequilibria could be levels of inequality that you want to correct. They could be the fact that people are smoking too much or eating the wrong sorts of food, and you want to correct that to improve their health. It could be that you believe that people are engaging in ecologically unsustainable practices that need to be corrected or brought into line. And the assumption underlying all of these is that A, experts can identify what the disequilibria are, and B, they can introduce mechanisms that will produce a more desirable outcome. Now, I sort of, if we use Foucault's language, problematize this kind of construction in two ways. First, I question the idea that societies are, in fact, knowable or manageable objects in this way. I don't think it's possible, and this is where I think there's a strong commonality with thinkers like Hayek. The idea that society, which is an inherently complex phenomenon, could be known by some central agency that knows how to maximize the welfare of the population is deeply problematic. So policymakers are often actually working in a fog of ignorance, where they don't know what the impact will be of the measures that they introduce. So that's one aspect of the challenge. But the second is that even if these attempts to manage society in this way don't actually work in many cases on their own terms, they have what Foucault calls power effects. So the attempt to exercise this kind of managerial control over society proliferates various kind of surveillance or managerial techniques throughout society, which are supposed to try to bring about the desired outcome. So people end up in multiple areas becoming enmeshed in audit cultures, performance management indicators, all of which are attempts by managers at various levels to claim that they are achieving some kind of social objective or outcome. Now, what's interesting is that many of these discourses, if you like, or technologies, they claim to be required in order to free people, to make people more liberated or to make them more equal. But actually what they do is produce whole networks of power and surveillance, which imprison people in cages almost of surveillance and control.
And that's what we see in so much of organizational life.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
We're not saying that because we're academics that live in audit cultures, but it's true. And that's what I think was so, when I was reading Foucault many years ago, was always attracted to the literatures that discuss that kind of that managerialism, that audit control, and it's very that governmentality as it referred to, this idea that you can kind of control. And that's where it as you say, it then shapes people's behavior, but it's also very constraining. And I mean, you see that in academia with in our line of work, where people looked at how many papers you've published and all the metrics around that. And in the UK, we have the Research Excellence Framework, and then there's a whole kind of circus around scoring papers in the journals. And then if you're in a business school, it's about, is it the journal in this particular list? And then, and if you've seen a CV from someone from a business school in the UK, it's really sad, because you're like, what do you actually do? And all they have is oh, I've published in this journal, and it's really sad, because it's anti-intellectual. It's like they're so concerned about fitting in these particular boxes. And you can't blame them, because their managers or the people that are judging their progress are looking at that. And it's like, well, no. And it's constraining, I think, and it's actually destroying intellectual life in a really, a lot of ways.
This goes into multiple other areas. So now, I mean, just when my book came out, it was released in the US a couple of weeks ago, but it's been online, I think, since April. When the book came out, it was immediately linked on the King's website, where I work, to UN Sustainable Development Goals. So you have to, you're already labeled about which social missions, or as Foucault would understand it, biopolitical objectives that your work is actually contributing to. Even though actually my book is questioning many of these narratives, I'm automatically linked with them by this kind of surveillance apparatus that's even operating at the level of universities. Because if you're applying for research grants now, you have to be demonstrating, which UN Sustainable Development Goal does this project contribute to? And this is all part of this whole nexus of surveillance and control and management, most of which doesn't work because no one knows how on earth these goals can be achieved. But what it does is empower whole loads of actors to exercise power and position over others by enforcing these kind of controls.
No, it's on the SDGs. If you say something, which I've done, and you sort of question, well, why do I have to tick this box? It has nothing to do with SDG 15, or, how do you even know? But if you even question and say, well, who decides that the SDGs are actually something we should focus on as a global community even, right?
Yeah.
And, if you do that, people look at you like, you're not committed to sustainable development. You're not committed to alleviating poverty and an ecological destruction. It's like, no, I didn't say that. I'm just questioning this particular apparatus that you're using, to use a Foucauldian word, that I find constraining. And for me, I want to deconstruct it and understand, well, what's the purpose behind this? Is it a box ticking exercise because, the university knows it's in a particular network? I mean, it's all that system of social control. But then when you try to question it, then you're deemed sort of as a dangerous person, right? And I think there's unfortunately too much self-censorship, and people are listening to my podcast. Please don't fire me. I don't think I'll get fired, but it's still, it's unfortunate. We've talked about this before. Maybe it's a good example to talk about the sustainability stuff. In education. And when I saw you a month or so ago in London, and I related the story when I was at the University of Bristol, and this was when the sustainability for education kind of movement was coming about. And I, along with a couple of colleagues, started a new program, an MSc in environmental policy and management. So there was an element behind the master's degree on looking about how corporations and environmental policy worked, and how you can kind of manage some of these ecological problems. So there is an element of sustainability, and I was fortunately away, which is probably better that week. But someone from the Sustainability for Education team, and talked to a good friend, colleague of mine, and he was telling me this story after. He's like, I didn't understand. I didn't know what to say, because they're like, how do you integrate sustainability and sustainable thinking into your course? And he said, well, all I said was, well, I teach environmental policy and politics, right? So I look at how environmental policies are made, the different tools, the different mechanisms. We look at different examples from different countries. We have students think about different scenarios. And, he didn't maybe talk. I think that the thing is, what he didn't do, and what we didn't do specifically, is we didn't kind of talk about sustainability in this sort of virtuous, term. And I think that was the big thing. But he thought it was a completely strange conversation. This is more than 10 years ago now, but now it's sort of mainstream. And I know you've dealt with that at King's. You won't get fired though, Mark. You'll be okay.
There are so many, there are so many assumptions that go into this. So, when you're told that you have to integrate sustainability, that already presupposes that we know what it means, that we know what sustainability looks like. So in Foucault's language, you're already assuming certain truths have been established, and also relationships which are going to be policing them. And this happens within academic disciplines, but it also happens, in the practical policy world. So I personally am quite sympathetic to arguments for having a carbon tax, for example, as a way to address climate change or to reduce emissions. And, there's a classic economic argument for that, is which the case for a carbon tax would be you send out a signal to people. It's not a proper market price signal, but it's still a signal that they need to change their behavior. But you're not telling them how they need to change their behavior.
And it's technologically,
to figure out which technologies to use or what foods to eat or whatever, you're leaving it to them. But most of the Greens, and especially those who become very influential in policy discourses, they don't want carbon taxation. They want actually something like a Foucauldian disciplinary apparatus, where every aspect of your behavior is ranked and graded according to whether or not it is more or less sustainable or more or less climate friendly. And they want to specify which are the good or the bad technologies, which are the good or the bad foods to eat. And this is a classic example from, in Foucault's terms, of a kind of totalizing system of control, which blocks out the space for people to give themselves their own rules, their own ethics for running their lives. Instead, you find yourself encased in this kind of, what he would call a panopticon of control and of surveillance.
But I mean, fortunately, though, a lot of these things, they don't last very long, right? I mean, already we're seeing the SDGs kind of slowly, fading away from corporate discourse. And I know universities are still using these things, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're dropped at some point. In part because, the SDGs have been around for a while and someone's going to look and say, if they achieved what they were supposed to achieve? And partly the problem with the SDGs is these are too broad, too cross-cutting to where, what are you measuring and where and how? And and again, just to emphasize, I'm not opposed to sustainable development and, there's a lot of really good things in the SDGs, right? I want clean water. I want clean air. I want, to empower women. I want to reduce poverty. Those are all great things, but this big kind of global apparatus, I just don't think it's going to work,
There's another aspect to this. So it applies to sustainability, but I think it also applies to areas like public health. And we saw this very much in the response to the pandemic, where if you are taking Foucault's position, where we think about certain forms of scientific expertise as being, to some extent, socially constructed, you have to look at the kind of what he would call the strategic logics, or maybe what other people might refer to as the incentives that are created by some of these discourses. So if we're in a discourse that claims that certain people have the expertise to direct society when there's a pandemic or when there's a climate crisis, you then have to ask, well, what does that do to the possibilities for pluralism of discussion? And I would say it's very problematic, because if you're in a situation where you're saying experts know what to do, then it's not going to be the interests of those experts for there to be too much of a range of opinion. Because the more the experts are seen in public, if you like, to disagree with each other, the more that expertise is undermined. So just in the same way that the medieval church didn't want to have too many rival religious authorities competing for people's patronage, likewise today, many of these experts have an incentive to close down the pluralism of opinion within their own range of expertise in order to preserve their own position and power. And this is what we saw in the pandemic, where people who had a range of different views were completely closed out from the conversation, because no, we have to have a unified view on what the science says. And of course, they weren't saying that we need to do this to maintain our position, but you could see how that might be a kind of logic that was underpinning the kind of censorship of people's opinions that took place during the pandemic. And that happens in many other sort of academic and expert fields.
No, I mean, it's quite shocking, actually. And I think it's worth emphasizing that you can recognize that without being, painted as some like right-wing reactionary that, was anti-vaxxer or whatever, right? I think, we all had our experiences during the pandemic, but I thought it was fascinating to see that there was very little allowance for dissent. Or if other countries were doing things differently, it was, take what Sweden did, right? For the longest time, Sweden was looked at as like this, and I traveled to Sweden with my family during the pandemic. It was fantastic. We had a great time during that summer. I won't go into it, but it was interesting to see how the chief epidemiologist was kind of ignored, and their outcomes are basically the same. Yeah. Or in the United States, Jay Bhattacharya, who's now the director of NIH, was completely pilloried and, shut out as being this crank, just complete ignorant to the actually the science of it. And it was very fascinating, right? And I think what was so fascinating was to see that how the supposedly more liberal countries, the Anglo-Saxon ones, were the most harsh lockdowns in the West. Much harsher than the Netherlands, where I was, or Sweden for that matter. Probably more harsh than the Germans. It was amazing to see what the Australians did in certain Australian states, what the UK. I shocked to hear people's stories about how their kids didn't go to school for nearly 2 years. Yeah. And it's just fascinating. And we don't seem to, I don't think we've learned a lesson from it.
No, and my feeling is actually that the pandemic was a more extreme form of things you can see happening in these so-called liberal societies in many other areas. So obviously lockdowns and the particular response to the pandemic and the way that opinion was closed down were a very particular and extreme form of this. But if you look at policies around obesity or passive smoking, you actually have a very similar dynamic, but perhaps in a less extreme form, where dietary guidance is given and enforced through law in a situation where there's actually much greater diversity of opinion about what those guidelines should be than people would ever know, because certain views become established and others get screened out. Passive smoking is another example of it. There's actually still very inconclusive evidence about whether passive smoking contributes to lung cancer. But nonetheless, we have all these bans on people being able to smoke in public places.
I personally, I like that though, because I don't like passive.
So do I.
Smoke.
So do I. Yeah. I hate tobacco. My father actually died from lung cancer because he was a smoker. So it's not like I'm an apologist for the tobacco industry. And I'm not opposed to people having rules against smoking, but the idea you have a blanket ban everywhere.
The way they do it,
no one can do this. Yeah. And now it's being extended to vaping or all these other sorts of practices. Yeah. And again, these are kind of examples of the sort of intersection between a set of ideas, the experts that those ideas privilege, if you like, or give position to, and then the policing mechanisms that you get to preserve these positions of power and authority that end up limiting the space for people to give themselves, at least to some degree, their own rules about how they live their lives.
Yeah. But is there not, I mean, I guess that's an argument against paternalism, but is it not? And I mean, we need another hour or two to kind of go into paternalism, but don't sometimes these kind of conspiracies, let's call them, have a point, right? That, I mean, you see the problem now with vaping is that it's, I don't care what adults do, but you have kids and children that are vaping and they can get them and it's like candy. And, I think there's a social responsibility of society to protect children personally. Right. And I think
that's reasonable. So this is not about saying there should never be any rules. Yeah. It's not about saying, because
that's where I think, I'm just going to say, because that's sometimes where libertarians or even, kind of more extreme liberals are just like, don't tell me what to do with my life and I should be able to do it. And it's like, yeah, but we live in a society and sometimes, and again, it's easy for us to sound, highly educated professors, with expertise and knowledge to assume that people are stupid, because I think that's what the pandemic showed, was that government thought that everyone was stupid and needed to be told what to do. And actually people aren't as stupid as we think, right? I think people are pretty wise, but at the same time, you do see some people who you think, wow, and maybe it's probably of economic deprivation, but communities where everyone's obese and you see them in the stores and they're loading up their trolleys with all these bad food and junk food, and you think like, actually we should go in and regulate this and we should sort of do something, because these people aren't going to help themselves. Or maybe I'm sounding too much of a paternalist.
I think you are in that case.
Yes.
So I think you've always got to figure out, so the way I would approach that would be, and this is a very sort of libertarian response, I guess. Yeah. If people can't buy nutritious food because they can't afford it, the solution to that problem, if there is a solution, is to give them the money and then let them spend that money on the food that they choose. Yeah. But what you don't want to have, I think, is what Foucault would call a normalizing society, where you are sort of giving pariah status to people who are putting those things in the cart that you disapprove of. And that's the danger of a lot of this. There's a lot of kind of middle, I'm sounding polemical here, but sort of middle class censoriousness about other people's behavior. Yeah. And it's given a sort of scientific veneer. Yeah. And you see this in multiple areas. And I think we've got to be very careful of that. So, I would say it's not about having no rules. Yeah. But it is about skepticism of any set of rules. So, I think in the liberal tradition, the emphasis would be not that you have no rules, but you have fractured authority, so that different places can experiment in different ways with different rules. So there isn't some sort of totalizing view about what the rules should look like. And then maybe we can figure out what works or what doesn't work, or whether things are actually socially constructed or whether they're not actually.
So we're running out of time. Everyone's going to go buy the book, Foucault and Liberal Political Economy, published by Oxford University Press. But final question, a hard question. What is bothering you the most about liberal society, liberal Western society? And I'm talking broadly about, Europe, North America, the liberal democracies of the world. What's bothering you the most?
So it is, in my view, and this is very much the theme of the second part of the book, that in many ways, these are no longer liberal societies. So there are still elements of liberalism in them. There are still, if you like, if we use Foucault's language, liberal discourses that still are present in these societies. But they're increasingly being colonized by illiberal discourses, which are manifestations of what Foucault calls pastoral power. And that's central to these dispositives that I look at in social justice, public health, sustainability, and law and order. And the key idea there is the notion that societies must be guided by various experts or pastors. They need to be put on the right path by the people with this kind of expertise. And it's this kind of discourse that sets in train all these surveillance mechanisms and managerial mechanisms that we've been talking about. You see this with diversity, equity, and inclusion. You see it with public health. You see it with sustainability. And this is gradually, not completely, but it is gradually closing the space for people to do things differently, to think differently, and even to speak differently. I mean, no one, if you'd have asked me 15 years ago, would freedom of speech be a live issue in contemporary Britain? I would have laughed at you. But now here we are in a situation where, people really don't feel that they can speak freely about multiple issues. So I think the question is, are the societies we call liberal democracies liberal anymore? And is there anything that we can do about it?
I agree 100% with what you've just said. I think you see this in day-to-day life, in the workspace, in the things we face, where I wish I could say that I have freedom of speech, that I can have conversations with people. But increasingly it's illiberal. And it's really unfortunate. And it's used to constrain and punish almost, and to ultimately stifle creativity, stifle debate. But what we can do, we can keep fighting. We can keep...
I think the interesting challenge is to, again, if you're using Foucault's ideas, what you don't want to do is, in your attempt to fight this, to reproduce the very thing that you are trying to fight. And I think that's a concern I have, for example, about the way the Trump administration is dealing with this in the US. Right. So there seems there to be an idea that in order to free people from some of these apparatuses, you need to have a disruptor in chief, whether it's Trump himself or Elon Musk or somebody else who's going to bust all these things up. But if you go for that model, A, it can be quite illiberal because you end up with people going into universities telling them what they can teach or who they can employ. But B, and I think in many ways this is the more disturbing aspect of it, you actually reproduce this very pastoral power, because you're saying to people that you can't be freed unless you have a liberator to free you from these apparatuses. What you really need, even though it's very hard perhaps for people to accept, is for people themselves as individuals and as communities to resist from the ground up some of these structures that they're in and to push back against them. And it requires people to be brave, to put their identity on the line, sometimes even their jobs on the line, as some people have done. To push back against this. Yeah.
All right. Mark Pennington, thanks for being on The New Enlightenment.
Thank you very much. Very good to be here.
You have been listening to The New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. If you found this interesting, please consider subscribing and sharing. If you would like to learn more about Panmure House, please go to our website, panmurehouse.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time.